It's Thursday, March 10, 2022. This is the news on PBCJ. I'm Gabrielle Thompson. Coming up, opposition to respond to budget. $100 billion earmarked for public sector compensation reform. And the JPS warns of possible increases. Regionally, Trinidad and Tobago to remove fuel subsidy. And in sports, West Indies try to hold on day 2 of the Apex Test series. Opposition spokesman on finance planning and public service, Julian Robertson, will give his reply today, March 10, in Parliament as the 2022-23 budget debate continues. We expect that he will touch on fuel prices, the education system, and the new $2,000 banknote. Live coverage will be on PBC Jamaica and our social media pages from 2 p.m. $100 billion. That's how much it will cost the government to overhaul the public sector compensation system over 3 years. The announcement came from Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Dr. Nigel Clark, as he delivered the opening presentation in the 2022-2023 budget debate in the House of Representatives. Dr. Clark highlighted the benefits of the exercise.
We will reform public sector compensation and restore a better, fairer, simpler and more transparent compensation system. It will be characterized by simplicity, better efficiency, improved pension and greater transparency for the individual and for the country, and ultimately will be a contributing factor to better quality service.
Under the theme Recovery, Reform and Restoration, the Finance Minister says while implementation is slated to commence on April 1, 2022, it doesn't mean it will be reflected in the April paycheck.
First, we want to have the opportunity to continue our engagement with public sector unions and bargaining groups and to provide more information and to fine-tune the system. We then propose, Madam Speaker, that early in the second quarter of the new fiscal year, the implementation will begin, but it will be effective, retroactive to April 1st, 2022. Every public sector employee will know from before what your salary will be this year, what it will be next year, and what it will be the third year, when we have completed the implementation of the new compensation system. You will have clarity and you will have transparency.
Dr. Clark made it clear this will be a new system, and once implemented, more will be expected of public servants, members of parliament and ministers. He says the new changes will lead to a significant rise in the wage bill, which will likely breach the wage to GDP target of 9% in Jamaica's fiscal responsibility laws. He added that the appropriate legislative amendment will be made this year.
With the start of compensation restructuring, the wage to GDP ratios are projected to be 11.4%, and this has already prompted concern. This reform is happening in a context where, as I said before, Jamaica is not yet out of the woods. Our debt is still very high, and our economy remains vulnerable to potential shocks.
The current public sector compensation structure comprises of 325 salary scales and 185 allowances. The Jamaica Public Service Company, JPS, says it is worried that rising fuel prices in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine will affect its customers and has called for a national response to the global crisis. Jamaica is heavily dependent on imported oil and natural gas for the production of electricity, transportation, and manufacturing. In a statement released on Wednesday, JPS's Chief Financial Officer Vernon Douglas said, quote, "The war in Ukraine means fuel is much more expensive and there is less of it. The prices of both oil and natural gas have increased since last year. They will increase much more now. A higher fuel cost means higher electricity costs." The CFO says the utility provider has no choice, saying, quote, "Fuel makes up about half of customers' electricity bills, so the changes from one month to the next can be quite significant." JPS is also concerned about the possible shortage of fuel for Jamaica. The company says it has started discussions with its fuel suppliers Petrojam and New Fortress Energy to assess their ability to meet the country's fuel needs. Chief Financial Officer Vernon Douglas says, quote, there could be a global fuel shortage as sanctions tighten on Russia. As a small country, Jamaica could be badly affected. Mr. Douglas says we all have to work together to get through this global crisis. And Mr. Douglas said he is relieved that the government plans to cushion the impact of increasing energy costs on the most vulnerable. He hopes the government will also suspend the fuel and electricity sales tax to further ease the burden on consumers during what he calls a difficult time. The government has spent $40.6 billion in response to the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. This was revealed by Finance Minister Dr. Nigel Clark as he opened the 2022-2023 budget debate in the House of Representatives. Dr. Clark noted this expenditure spanned across 2 fiscal years and represented 2% of gross domestic product GDP.
In Jamaica, where 16% of GDP goes to interest and wages and salaries, which are non-discretionary expenditures and can't easily be changed, as compared to other, and much higher, much higher, as you'll see later, than other countries in our region, where that 16% is like 8 or 12, finding 2% of GDP in a crisis and remaining fiscally sound is a big deal.
The finance minister took the opportunity to boast of Jamaica's speedy recovery amid what was seen as one of the worst economic crises to hit the world.
While other economies in our region wobbled in the last fiscal year, Jamaica staged a strong, robust and historic recovery, and that was no accident. With the blessings of God Almighty and good policy choices. Good policy choices. The historic shock delivered by the pandemic did not, as in the past, lead to a debt crisis, did not, as in the past, lead to a fiscal crisis, did not, as in the past, lead to a balance of payments crisis, and any of these knock-on effects would have greatly prolonged our recovery. Instead, the Jamaican economy came roaring back with 14% growth in the first quarter of the fiscal year. The highest quarterly growth ever recorded in Jamaica, albeit from a decline the previous year before, and a historic decline. A historic decline. 5.8% growth in the second quarter of the fiscal year, a projected 6% growth in the third quarter of the fiscal year, and a projected 7 to 9%, they'll never believe it, for 2021-22.
A parliamentary women's caucus is being established. Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Olivia Babsy-Grange, made the announcement as the country celebrated International Women's Day on March 8.
A women's parliamentary caucus, which comprises women from both sides of the divide, from the opposition and the government, and from the Senate and the House of Representatives. This organization, or this body that is being established in Parliament, is now being put together by a core group led by Member of Parliament Tamika Davis.
Minister Grange says regulations are being tailored that will govern how the caucus will operate.
In establishing the core group, I made the point that the Parliamentary Women's Caucus can be an important vehicle for achieving inclusive development and most likely to succeed when they are designed to meet the context within which they operate. We have the largest number of women in Parliament ever in the history of this country.
She was speaking at the ministry's The Empowerment Forum held by the Bureau of Gender Affairs under the theme Breaking Barriers, Empowered Women, Empowering Women. Dr. Paul Robertson will be accorded a state funeral on Saturday, March 12 at the University of the West Indies Mona Chapel. Robertson died at the St. Anne's Bay Hospital on February 19 following a brief illness. Mr. Robertson served his country in various capacities, including as Member of Parliament for South East St. Catherine from 1993 to 2007, a government minister, senator and vice president and general secretary of the People's National Party (PNP). He also served as special assistant to late former Prime Minister Michael Manley from 1978 to 1980. Before beginning his political career, Dr. Robertson taught at his alma mater, Oberlin High School, in 1965 and 1968, and lectured in the Department of Government at the UWI from 1968 to 1969 and from 1973 to 1974, where he also pursued studies. Dr. Robertson retired from public life in 2007, was given a senior position at the Port Authority of Jamaica in 2012. Motorists will dig a little deeper into pockets and purses this week as state-owned oil refinery Petrojam has announced an increase in prices for gas and diesel. This plus our usual market updates in today's edition of the Business Report with Danita Rodney.
As of Thursday, March 10, motorists will have to pay more for gas as Petrojam announced a $4.50 increase on all gas prices. 87 gasoline will be sold for $186.93 per liter. 90-octane gasoline will be sold for $191.92 per liter. Automotive diesel fuel will be sold for $190.97 per liter. And ultra-low sulfur diesel will be sold for $195.47 per liter. Continuing with the increase, kerosene will be sold for $165.57 per liter. Propane liquid petroleum will be sold for $84.82 per liter. And butane liquid petroleum will be sold for $94.01 per liter. Remember to be on the lookout for price changes as marketing companies and retailers will add their own markup to these prices. In foreign exchange trading for Wednesday, March 9, the US dollar sold for an average of $154.44. The Canadian dollar ended trading at $120.22. The pound sterling traded for $204.19. And the euro sold for an average of $171.30. The following reflects the movement of the JSE indices in Wednesday's trading session. The JSE index declined by 817 points to close at over 300,000 units. The junior market index declined by 76 points to close at over 3,000 units. The combined market index declined by 1,434 points to close at over 300,000 units, and the All-Jamaican Composite Index declined by 1,032 points to close at over 400,000 units. Overall market activity resulted from trading in 102 stocks, of which 34 advanced, 52 declined, and 16 traded firm. 138 Student Living Jamaica Limited, 138 Student Living Jamaica Limited Variable Preference, and 1834 Investments Limited saw an advancement in their stocks, while Access Financial Services Limited, Barita Investments Limited, and Berger Paints Jamaica Limited saw a decline. Community and Workers of Jamaica Deferred Shares, Consolidated Bakeries Jamaica Limited, and Elite Diagnostic Limited traded firm. Wisynco Group Limited Ordinary Shares was the volume leader with over 4 million units, followed by QWI Investments Limited with over 3.7 million units, and Future Energy Source Company Limited Ordinary Shares with over 3.6 million units. In market data for oil, oil prices bounced on Thursday from a sharp drop in the previous session after the UAE backtracked on statements saying that the OPEC and its allies might increase output to help to plug the gap in exports from Russia. Brent crude futures were up $5.43, or 4.9%, at $116.57 a barrel, and West Texas Intermediate crude futures were up $4.49 or 4.1% at $113.19 a barrel. And that was the business report on PBCJ. I'm Danita Rodney.
In news across the region, we begin in Barbados. Speaking during Ghana's 65th independence anniversary celebrations at the Cape Coast Stadium over the weekend, Prime Minister Mia Mottley has suggested that Africa-CARICOM Day should be celebrated on September 7 in recognition of the first ever Africa-Caribbean Summit aimed at forging stronger social and economic ties between the two global communities.
On the 7th of September last year, when we came together for the first ever African CARICOM, I want to let you know that it was your President's visit to Barbados in 2019, along with President Kenyatta, that allowed us, as I was getting ready to chair the Caribbean community, to agree that we should have that first summit. Alas, COVID visited us, and what was to be the first summit of June 2020 ultimately became the summit of the 7th of September 2021. My friends, out of that summit, we agreed to establish a permanent forum for African and Caribbean territories and states, and that forum would be jointly coordinated by the African Union and the CARICOM Secretariat. We agreed also to take steps that the 7th of September shall forever be known as Africa-CARICOM Day. And we ask you, our brothers and sisters in Ghana, as we will in Barbados, to celebrate that day with the knowledge that those of us across the Atlantic can never be divided, not even by the forces of history or the passage of time.
Over now to Trinidad and Tobago. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley said government had to cut the fuel subsidy or the country would have been in a dire economic situation. More details in this TTT Live report.
Government had to cut the fuel subsidy for this country or would have been in a dire economic situation, says Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley. During Tuesday evening's conversation with the Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley explained his government's decision.
$16 billion in 36 months as a fuel subsidy. Nobody says I'm not going to go down the road because I'll be caught in traffic, and in that traffic I'll be burning twice as much fuel as against making the trip a little later or a little earlier.
He noted that only in the first 5 years, from 1997 to 2001, was there enough money in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to cover the fuel subsidy. However, from 2002 onward, government had to add money to cover the fuel subsidy.
Couldn't pay public servants. We had to do something about this, because if this was allowed to continue, the country would have been bankrupt.
Dr. Rowley added that no other nation in the Caribbean has a fuel subsidy.
And in the Bahamas, outlining the budget for the 2021-2022 fiscal year, Prime Minister Philip Davis says the Minnis administration failed to enact significant liabilities and unfunded obligations to the tune of $1 billion. Jasmine Brown tells us more.
In his more than hour-long communication, the Prime Minister went far beyond giving an update on the country's fiscal standing.
The previous administration failed to disclose significant liabilities and unfunded obligations of the government, totaling some $821.5 million, almost $1 billion.
Davis says the liabilities and unfunded obligations includes $255.3 million in debt and interest payments related to the government taking over the legacy debt of BPL, $155.5 million in unpaid bills and other obligations for state-owned enterprises, $25.7 million for the Ministry of the Public Service, largely representing outstanding payments for insurance services, $17.7 million for the Office of the Attorney General to settle outstanding legal claims, $14.2 million in VAT refunds for the Department of Inland Revenue. And that's not all.
$15.8 million for the Ministry of Health, which include outstanding payments owed to Doctors Hospital for critical care of COVID-19 patient support. $129.5 million in unfunded contract obligations for the Ministry of Public Works. $23 million in bills for water purchase by the Water and Sewage Corporation. $56 million for the Public Hospital Authority, which includes over $25 million in potential liabilities for the 2018 union agreement and $34.2 million for the Ministry of Tourism, including a significant amount of unpaid bills for Bahamas Air.
As he provided a line-by-line breakdown for the $1 billion disparity in the Minnis administration's pre-election economic and fiscal update report, the PM also accused the former administration of not being forthcoming with the Bahamian people. Davis also tabled a Deloitte report which found that the Minnis administration's report was only partially compliant with the Fiscal Responsibility Act in its revenue and expenditure forecasts and was non-compliant with the FRA in detailing its new spending and outstanding stock of arrears. Davis says what is also frustrating is some vendors have been refusing to cooperate with the government.
In trying to determine the most accurate picture of the public finances, many vendors have chosen not to cooperate in providing even the most basic information, or continue to stall and attempt to frustrate efforts to determine who received public funds, in what amounts, for what purpose, and under what terms. This is extremely unwise.
Now, when it comes to the state of the country's finances, Davis insisted that the Bahamas is headed in the right direction and moving away from the fiscal cliff, as figures indicated a year-over-year increase in revenue as the deficit and debt to GDP ratio both decreased.
While the external economic environment does still remain favorable, going forward, it is clear that we will need to remain vigilant and prudent.
And as you heard, the Prime Minister had a lot to say in Parliament today, and much of it did not place the previous administration in the best light. We can expect as the debate continues, more will be revealed.
And in sports, a last session consolidation by Jason Holder and Nkrumah Bonner saw the West Indies battle their way back into the opening test after a top-order collapse had threatened to derail their progress on the second day of the Apex Test series at the Vivian Richards Cricket Stadium. Stumbling at tea on 127 for 4 after losing 4 quick wickets, West Indies hit back through an unbroken 5th wicket stand of 75 between Holder and Bonner to end the day on 202 for 4, 109 runs adrift of a first innings lead. Holder, starting his innings after the final interval, was unbeaten on 43 at the close and was partnered by Bonner on 34. The pair ensuring England went without success in the final session, marred by breaks due to rain. Here are some highlights. And with that, we call an end to today's newscast. On behalf of our entire news production team, thanks for watching the news and for making it PBCJ, the People's Station.